Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
And I'm on the heels of a very uneventful weekend. Morgan, quite the opposite with you. You had an exciting weekend that Pat George and I have been following.
Yeah, I had a big weekend up in Washington, D.C. I got to go to the Federalist Society National Lawyers Convention, which runs Thursday through Saturday every year in mid-November, and got to see quite a bit. I wasn't there for the entire convention, but I got to see quite a bit while I was there. And I have to tell you, it really made my trip when I was able to meet, shake hands with, and get a photograph with Attorney General William Barr, who I have a great amount of respect for. And as President Trump would say, he's a greatly respected man, which he is. And he gave a fascinating lecture, and it's called the Barbara Olson Memorial Lecture, which we all remember the story of Barbara Olson was on one of the planes. I don't remember which one of the planes it was, but one of the planes in the 9/11 terrorist attack, and lost her life in that attack. And so back at that time, the Federalist Society began a memorial lecture series for her. And Ted Olson usually attends. Ted Olson, of course, is an interesting guy because he's kind of turned liberal on us. I don't know if you're aware of all those little details. That's kind of Washington insider stuff that if you live in Washington, D.C., you know all those little nuances and details. But those of us out here in real America, as we'll call it, outside the Beltway, generally don't know all the little nuances and goings-on with the different key players in Washington.
Did you see anybody else from the Tampa Bay area there?
Oh, sure. There were a lot of people from Tampa there. In fact, I think we had our largest contingent from Tampa that we've ever had there. We had a very large contingent from the state of Florida. And we usually have a good showing from the entire state of Florida, but we had a great group from Tampa, including the general counsel for Ashley Moody was there. Now, he's obviously moved up to Tallahassee, but a good man, an old friend of mine, and so it was enjoyable to get to spend a little bit of time with him because I don't get to see so much of him anymore since he's moved to Tallahassee. He's quite busy in everything that he's working on. But we had a good group from our local chapter here in Tampa, maybe 8 or 10 folks, maybe even a little more than that, went up from the Tampa Bay area. So, and these are all people that I'm pretty closely familiar with since I was the president of the local chapter of the Federalist Society for a number of years and been involved since I was in law school. So now we're going back a couple of decades.
Any impeachment talk?
Well,
what was the buzz as far as since William Barr was there? I mean,
he was there, and I'll tell you, you've got to go out and listen to his speech. And this is I was going to see if we could do a segment a little bit later in the show, but we've got so many topics to try to cover today. Maybe we just go ahead and cover it now. I'd kind of jump to the front with the William Barr speech, but you should go out there if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the thought process of the Attorney General. That entire speech, you can find it online. You can find it probably on the Federalist Society website, which is fedsoc, FEDSOC.org. And you can also find it other places. The Conservative Treehouse, one of our favorite websites for commentary, has the entire transcript of it along with a link to the video of the speech. Now, it's a rather lengthy speech. I'd say maybe 45 minutes to an hour. I wasn't timing it. Maybe it's even a little longer than that, but it's a fascinating speech all about the unitary executive as a theory and as an originalist theory. And what you mean when you say something like originalism or originalist is trying to understand the structure of the government by taking the words as they were used on the papers at the time and what was the ordinary meaning of those words to the average person at the time. So you're basically trying to understand what did they mean at the time that they wrote it and not what would we think it to mean today as we read it. And this is a very useful way to interpret all laws because you are trying – I mean, what does a law mean, right? Does it mean – go ahead.
I was going to say they don't have perspective. Those who wrote it back then don't have perspective as to what the future will hold. So you can only hold it at the value of what did they mean at that point in time.
Well, and I guess what you're trying to understand is what does the law mean? You know, when laws are written, when laws are passed, or even when political theories are created, when they're discussed, what did they mean by them? Now, we might use words differently today, as we often do, than they used them in the past. But how do you can't really get to the core, the starting point for understanding, unless you can understand what they meant by it. It's the true nature is, what did it mean to the average person in normal speech at the time?
There was a picture of you with Bill Barr, but there was something you were holding in your hand also. What was that? You seemed pretty proud you had that in your hand.
Well, I did. In a good topic to raise at this time, that we're talking about the idea of originalism. I was permitted, and this was something great that the Federalist Society did, and the gentleman who actually owned these 2 volumes was able to do. That's not the picture. It's a different picture that he's talking about. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just a picture of me with William Barr at a reception. And that was after his speech on the Unitary Executive. But the Federalist Society had an ongoing exhibition of the first edition copies of the Federalist Papers. Now, the Federalist Papers are famously a series of short essays that were written by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, and were published in the papers, particularly the New York papers, and it was an effort to get people to support and approve the new federal Constitution. And remember, this was a tumultuous time. It wasn't a clear path that we were always going to have a Constitution. Prior to the Constitution, we had the Articles of Confederation, and there were groups who believed that even that was too much, or that we should stick with something like that, which was a less connected confederation of independent sovereigns, or should we move into this more what they call federalist position, where, yes, the states are independent, but they're connected with a slightly stronger central government that has a larger role to play. Rather than just being a council of the state governments, this is actually a separate government that has its own spheres, own areas that it controls within the body of laws and controls the nation. And there's a lot of, we could speak for hours about this particular debate, but you had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So the Federalist Papers were designed to try and win over the hearts and minds of the people to the idea of this new Constitution that was being proposed and voted on at the time. So they were originally printed in the papers in 1787, but also very soon thereafter they were bound into book volume, a couple of volumes of books, 2 volumes actually, and sold as books. And again, this was sort of a way to have the collected Federalist Papers all in one place if you were so interested. And at the time, many people were interested in having that. So I was able, thanks to the Federalist Society's work and thanks to the generous gentleman who I got to speak with for a few minutes who actually owned these copies of the Federalist Papers, to hold and also hear from some learned professors about some first edition copies of the 2 volumes of the Federalist Papers in book form. So you can see a picture of me holding it very proudly. I thought that was just, I'm a big fan of history, a student of history, and I was thrilled to be able to hold something that was actually printed up in 1787. Actually, those volumes were printed in 1788 because, again, originally they ran these in the paper, but they then very quickly thereafter printed them into book form. But I wanted to circle back, and I know we're going to run out of time on this, but just wanted to circle back to the idea of the unitary executive because it's an idea that I think a lot of people don't have a full understanding of. Certainly our media culture does not portray it in the correct way, as Attorney General Barr mentioned during his lecture, and I just so highly recommend that if you're interested in civics and government, his lecture is well worth listening to. It was the best program that I saw at the entire conference, and I hate to say by far, but I want to say by far. Mm-hmm. It was a fascinating history of the concept of the unitary executive and why the framers and the founders of our country decided that that was something important. That was a concept that they supported and that they wanted to ensconce within our government as a very effective way to have executive power. And so, I think we'll end up talking some after the break about this. But just to go through the supporters of the concept of the unitary executive, you're talking about George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, who was the leader of the Anti-Federalist cause, who was no friend of a centralized government, but even he was a very strong supporter of the need for a unitary executive. And a lot of people are saying, gosh, Morgan, you keep using that word, unitary executive, but what do you mean by it? And we'll get into that some in the next segment. But I shouldn't leave out James Madison, George Mason, John Jay, and there are many, many others that I could mention. We've got a lot more on that topic and others, including what's going on in Hong Kong when we come back.
Back on the Morgan Streetman Show, a lot to get to today. We kind of didn't have a chance to get into our local interests. You are our local interest, Morgan, with your travels.
Well, we do have local interest. We promise we've got actually 2 local interest stories. You could call it 3 technically, that we do want to cover during the show. So I think we will circle back to those.
Okay.
We also had a quick look back segment, which we normally start with, but we will circle back to it when we get a little bit of time. But before I jump back into talking about the unitary executive and Attorney General Barr's speech, which I highly recommend that everybody go out there and watch, I don't think you'll be disappointed at the end of the hour or 45 minutes that the speech is. It's a fascinating speech, and I think you'll learn a lot about the unitary executive and get a better understanding so that when the mainstream media tells you that it's some kind of an evil idea and it's all about creating an unchecked monarchy, essentially, in the presidency, that's all false. That's not at all what it's about. It's an idea that was held by all of the framers of the Constitution and all of the founding fathers at the time, and they had some very good reasons for holding it. But before we go back to that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on in Hong Kong. And if you're interested in this, I couldn't take my eyes off it, frankly, this morning. I got up early to do some additional prep for the show since I got home fairly late.
This has been going on for 5 months.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's definitely escalated recently. It's gotten much more violent. We've seen a number of people shot in Hong Kong. I know it's probably less than 10 that have been reported so far. But now we're seeing this morning as I was watching it, you can actually pull up the live stream videos of it, and I tweeted out a link on my Twitter account to those videos. It's @MoStreetman. So if you want to go check that out, and I don't know the exact status of it because I was watching it a little bit earlier this morning, and things may have calmed down some as it's gotten later at night over there. But I would tell you that watching these videos, there were actual instances where I saw Hong Kong police officers with AR-15s taking aim at protesters, and I didn't see any of them actually pull the trigger. But, of course, we're only seeing so much on these videos. It's one camera in one place and not everywhere that they might be. So there's definitely an escalation. Now, part of this came from the fact that the protesters and the students at that university there where they are protesting were throwing Molotov cocktails at the police and other things. And, it's an interesting question as we sort of ponder, the idea of the Second Amendment, and I would wonder, and some people may be slightly offended by this thought process. I don't know. I think there are people who want to be offended about a lot of things anymore. They're actually going around looking for things to be offended about. But, I would wonder if the people in Hong Kong are happy that they don't have Second Amendment rights. And so none of them have the opportunity to be armed or to defend themselves against what they view as totalitarian government. And actually, interestingly, at the conference, I got to speak with a young man who was Chinese from China and discussed the Hong Kong protests with him. And he was explaining to me how originally the protests started off, as we told you, because the leader of Hong Kong, who was installed by Beijing, she's strictly a puppet of Beijing, and that's how the people in Hong Kong view her, Carrie Lam, that she had basically put forward this extradition bill where they were going to be able to very easily extradite people from Hong Kong to mainland China to stand trial. Now, if you stand trial in mainland China, it's something akin to like the presidential impeachment. It's done in secret. You don't get to confront your accusers. And the idea is that perhaps you should come and testify to try to prove your innocence. But let me assure you, if they try you there, they're not actually interested in you proving your innocence. And even if you were to prove it, there's really no chance that they would find you to be not guilty. So who wants to be tried by a communist government in a secret trial in China? And none of the people in Hong Kong want this to be the law of their land. So Carrie Lam, the leader of Hong Kong, had pushed this forward, and that's really what kicked off the protests. But as I was talking to this young man, who's now a law student here in the United States, very bright young man, really enjoyed talking to him and getting his perspective. He was explaining to me that the parties have really become calcified in their positions. And even though the extradition bill has been withdrawn, and that's probably a temporary withdrawal to try to take some of the steam out of the protests, that now that's certainly not going to be good enough for the Hong Kong people that are protesting. And now they want more. Now, what more actually means, I'm unclear about, because, this is a struggle between the protesters who want more freedoms, more isolation and independence from mainland China. However, the British, if we remember, a number of years ago, ceded Hong Kong back to Chinese government in a process that took a number of years to occur, but has now occurred.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I was there 3 years ago in Hong Kong. The person who we stayed with, family member, talked about, we would go out at night to restaurants, nightclubs, walk around by ourselves. She was a single woman living over there, and she said, I really feel safe all the time because there are no guns here.
Yeah.
3 years later, a different story.
Yeah,
there are no guns there, but like to your point, I wonder how those protesters feel without that right.
Right. Well, and how much progress could they be making in getting their demands met if they were armed? I mean, you don't want war anywhere, but I'm telling you, what we were seeing this morning on the video cameras has echoes of Tiananmen Square, where thousands of people were killed by the Chinese government. And this could be happening again, and they will do this again if they deem it necessary. And as the young man was telling me, at this point, the Chinese government's calcified in its position of reestablishing authoritarian control over Hong Kong, because to not do so and to allow the protesters to, quote unquote, win or to extract concessions would create a loss of face for the Chinese government. And that is not something that they're willing to accept. And if you understand sort of the Eastern mind and the way that they view the idea of the loss of face, I mean, it's a very difficult thing for them to accept. In fact, I think they essentially cannot accept it. So now we've got the two sides very hardened in their positions, and we've got outright violence occurring on the streets where, again, we're seeing people, Hong Kong police officers with AR-15s taking aim, and I would assume in some instances shooting the protesters in the crowd. So, again, you could go out to my Twitter feed if you want to see the live stream. You'll get some versions of the videos on different news wires and such. But I recommend, sometime when you have the opportunity, checking out the live stream, because you get the unedited version of it and you can see sort of what's really going on. And I was just fascinated by it this morning. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. So, all right, well, let's jump back and talk just a little bit more about the unitary executive, because I think it's a very interesting concept and political theory, and it's not new. And that's important, because if you saw the movie Vice about Vice President Dick Cheney.
Saw that.
You did see it?
I did.
Apparently, I didn't see it. So apparently there was a scene in there where Vice President Cheney and somebody else, and I don't remember if it was Attorney General Barr at that time.
I think it could have been, because I remember seeing him in the movie. Yep. Okay,
where they were sitting around conspiring to come up with the concept of the unitary executive, where all power could be placed in a single man in this country or something like that. And that's absolute nonsense. This was actually a concept.
I remember that scene vaguely.
You do?
I
Okay.
think
So that was in there, and Attorney General Barr made reference to it, but that was not a correct reading of historically how the concept came about and when it came about. Now, the concept of the unitary executive means the executive power is in one person, and it's not all the power in the government, but the executive power. Now, there are certain functions that just don't lend themselves to having councils and don't lend themselves to having a number of people that you have to discuss and you have to build a consensus to get anything done. And among those are the powers such as faithfully executing and enforcing the laws. I mean, that requires essentially a unity of purpose. You can't be sitting around always debating what's the proper way to enforce the laws or execute the laws, but you need someone who believes that they understand them and who will do what it takes in that person's mind to enforce them. And it's important to remember that the president's elected every 4 years, and that was part of the concept, that you can have this unitary power in one person who is regularly elected on a national level. And it's the only person who's elected by the entire nation at once. You know, when we go to elect our senators and our congresspeople, it's either a statewide election or a smaller congressional district election. But other functions that lend themselves especially to the idea of a single person handling them are foreign policy, because you can't have all of these. Well, look what we're having now. The discussions are being leaked. All these other people are kind of involved in the discussions. Now, they're part of the executive branch, but they're not performing their duties and keeping these deliberations secret and confidential, which is required of them, which they're supposed to do. You've got guys like Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who's part of the impeachment proceedings, and he's going around the backside telling, like the Ukrainians, don't listen to the president, don't do what he says, and other things like that. We'll talk a little more when we come back.
We are back on the Morgan Streetman Show. And Morgan, you were explaining a little bit more about the unification of the executive powers. Yes.
Yeah, in a single person. And I thought one part in particular, I mean, you got to go out there and listen to Bill Barr's speech. One part in particular, though, I really enjoyed, and I'm going to kind of read it to you or paraphrase it to you. But he said, because, you know, he's being attacked right now for this speech, saying it was highly political. But it really wasn't political. It was an education in civics and an understanding of where this concept came from. And in fact, he spoke against the politicization of the entirety of what the government is supposed to do. And that politicization is encapsulated in the idea of the resistance movement. You know, as he said immediately after President Trump won the election, his opponents, the Democrats, and he didn't say Democrats, I added that, but they inaugurated what they called the resistance, and they rallied around an explicit strategy of using every tool and maneuver that they could to sabotage the functioning of President Trump's administration. As Attorney General Barr said, resistance is the language used to describe insurgency against rule imposed by an occupying military power. So even their language is loaded up with this idea of resisting an occupation, an illegitimate military invasion, which clearly that completely disrespects the fact that President Trump won the election. I mean, 63 million people, or however many it was exactly, voted for him. A bunch of people voted for him. Now, some people didn't like him, and a bunch of people voted against him also. But the point is that a lot of people in this country voted for him, and under the Electoral College, enough voted for him to be the legitimate, duly elected president. Now, Attorney General Barr went on to cover the fact that instead of viewing themselves as the loyal opposition, as has always been done in this country, when your party did not prevail in the presidential election or in other elections, you tended to view yourself as loyal opposition, but now they view themselves as the resistance. And any tool that they can use to frustrate the functioning of government is legitimate in the resistance. So he said a prime example of this is the Senate's advise and consent role for presidential nominees.
So we have 5 more years of resistance, I guess.
Well, it's an interesting question because I have to tell you, I mean, I think the country is still pretty equally divided, 50-50. Now, my judgment is that there's no way that President Trump could lose the election. But certainly I talked to some smart people, some of whom I really respect, and some folks, and these are not D.C. insiders, but some folks said, look, they think it's essentially President Trump's going to lose no matter who the Democrats nominate, because the Democrats are so fired up, because our country is divided essentially right down the middle in terms of overall population, how each side feels. And, of course, the other thing you have to think about is some of these changes that we've seen recently, for instance, in Florida with the restoration of felon voting rights. Now, I'm sure that the ex-felons, will not vote as a voting bloc 100% one way or the other, but I'm equally as sure that they're going to lean Democrat. And, of course, that's 1 million people who were not allowed to vote, who live in the state of Florida, who now will be allowed to vote in the next election. So how, if you remember, some elections in our state of Florida have been decided by about 500 votes, statewide elections. I'm thinking back to Bush v. Gore. So one wonders what
Florida's
effect.
Key.
Yeah, and one wonders what effect is it going to be to add 1 million new voters who probably lean, I'm guessing, fairly heavily Democrat. And, of course, you've got all the voter fraud issues as well. But to jump back to Attorney General Barr's speech, the advise and consent role that the Senate has traditionally fulfilled and is constitutionally supposed to fulfill is designed to keep unqualified nominees from passing. However, that's not how the Senate is using that role. Instead, they're using it to frustrate every nominee, even well-qualified nominees. And just to give an example, in order to proceed to a vote, the Senate has been forced to invoke what's called cloture, which means you would need 60 votes to stop the vote from proceeding, 236 times in President Trump's first term of office. Just to compare that, how many times was the Senate forced to seek cloture on President Obama's nominees during his first term? 17. And how about during President George W. Bush's first term? 4 times. You can see this method is increasing in use, and particularly under President Trump, it's up more than 1,000%. And that's completely unheard of in history and is completely inappropriate unless you view every action through the lens of the idea that you are resisting some kind of military occupation, and that's the position that the Democrats have taken. Well, let's jump into some of our local interest, and it dovetails nicely, so I'll just start with one mention, and that is that President Trump has announced that Pam Bondi will be taking over as one of his lead representatives in the impeachment proceedings, which I think is a fantastic development. One, Pam Bondi obviously is from this area prior to her being the first female attorney general of the state of Florida.
She grew up here. She still lives here.
She lives here. She had a storied history as a very fine prosecutor. She was also a television commentator for many years on many different channels.
And this will put her in the history books.
Oh, this will certainly put her in the history books. Now, she's got, the thing about Pam Bondi, she's got a very sharp mind. She knows how to use evidence. She understands the law and the concepts of criminal law, and she will be able to effectively represent the president's position on television nationally. And so I think it's a great move by the president. And I think that he will be well served by Pam Bondi, who will be an excellent representative for him. And he needs somebody like her out there making the case night after night, day after day on the various news programs, because she can forcefully make a case. And not everybody apparently can do that, as we've seen in the impeachment proceedings. The Republicans seem to have a bunch of, let's just say they don't appear to have been varsity players, and they just don't seem to know what they're doing in terms of questioning these impeachment witnesses. So that's one local interest. Had a couple of others. Pat George, there's one you brought up, and I'd like you to speak briefly to this. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. But we had some human trafficking arrests here in the Bay Area recently.
Apparently over the weekend, Hillsborough County deputies, along with the sheriff, had his news conference this morning that 100 in the trafficking area of just about everywhere. And he touched on this, that he would not, because the Super Bowl's on the way, WrestleMania's on the way, the Final Four, it will not be tolerated if you want to come into this area. And pretty much human trafficking. We talked about this, that it's prostitution is, at least 50% of that.
Yeah, yeah.
If not more.
Yeah.
And it's young people, too.
Yeah, they said that
Underage.
this, in the news conference, he said it was so heinous what they did. He didn't even want to describe it, but he said that they took 2 men to a trailer. A man took 2 men, and he said, this is your opportunity of a 14-year-old and either a 13-year-old. And they just jumped at the chance. And they were
despicable. And, it is interesting that you bring up all those big events, Pat, because those events attract that kind of behavior. Isn't that creepy?
And apparently, Hillsborough County be ready for it.
Yes,
Hopefully,
yes. And Hillsborough County, this is a great bust, but there's a lot of that activity that goes on here, more than you would think.
Some very disturbing stuff, really. Some very disturbing stuff. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Epstein case and some of the players in that coming up. And, of course, that could be the largest human trafficking ring in history, is some of the stuff that we see in the media. But one other quick local interest story, just wanted to mention out there. Police are searching for a vehicle that struck a bicyclist. This is back on November 1st. The bicyclist was struck crossing 49th Street on the Pinellas Trail. And you can go out and find this video at a number of places. Has just been recently posted online. But I'd recommend you go out there and watch it because, it's unbelievable just to watch this car strike this bicyclist who's in a crosswalk that is flashing. You know how we have the flashing crosswalks everywhere that are supposed to catch motorists' attention and tell them to slow down, but just rams right into the bicyclist, flips him over the roof of the car, and the gentleman ends up breaking a few bones. Thankfully, he wasn't hurt much worse than that or even killed, but the driver of the car gets out, moves the bicycle out of the way, and then drives off. And so they're currently looking for whoever was the driver of this white Chrysler 200. But that's right here in St. Petersburg. And, we know the Bay Area is one of the most dangerous places in the country for bicyclists.
It is.
And we've seen them install all these additional bike lanes, certainly within the city of Tampa. They've got bike lanes everywhere. But you're really sort of taking your life in your own hands to use them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, last week we lost one on, I think it was 301. Morris Bridge Road or 301 area. He was riding to work at 5 o'clock in the morning.
I remember that one.
In the bike lane, hit from behind. Could you imagine just riding your bike and you just get hit? At 45, 55 miles an hour. Guy kept going. Next day he called and turned himself in, said he thought he hit something, but he wasn't sure what it was.
Yeah.
I do feel like with those who are using their bikes and in the bike lane, just err on the side of caution and be farther to the right, because you do have so many people that just are distracted drivers and they're not, and they're veering.
Turn your back.
No, exactly. So take precaution. It shouldn't be that way. You should be safe to be able to just be in the bike lane, but be careful.
Well, isn't it amazing how people are operating a several thousand-pound vehicle with all that inertia at all that speed, and there's nothing more important to them than keeping up with their text messages or doing whatever it is they're doing on their phone. And I know you've all seen it as you've all been driving around the Bay Area. We constantly see people who have their phone out, held, right in front of them near the steering wheel or other places, and I don't even know what it is they think is so important on that stupid little device. But when you're operating a car, the most important thing for you to do is to pay attention. And you're supposed to be, remember, did anyone take driver's ed? You remember you're supposed to be checking the mirrors and everything? You're supposed to kind of have a system of continually checking what's going on around you so that things like this don't happen.
Worst thing I saw in a long time. Last Thursday night, busy night, 6 o'clock, Bush Boulevard in Nebraska, approaching the intersection. Green, we're all going through it. I look over I'm in the inside lane. I look over to my right, and this is an elderly couple. White hair, a lot older, both of them with phones in front of them holding up. The driver and the passenger, both holding the phones.
Just insane.
Let's call and have a conversation if we're in the car. Don't text when you're in the car.
Well, and they even say maybe you shouldn't even call and have the conversation. Maybe just pay attention to what you're doing. I tell you what, you don't want to end up being one of those drivers who accidentally, and we say, I should put accidentally in quotes there, because you're the one who made the decision to be looking at your phone. So how much of an accident is it? You're charged with the knowledge that this kind of thing can happen. But you don't want to be one of those folks who accidentally hits somebody and, God forbid, kills them. Imagine how you would feel, or at least how you should feel, for the rest of your life. When we come back, we're going to jump into a little bit on Jeffrey Epstein. Stick around.
Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. About this time, we love to go out there. And boy, is it out there. Everything that's gone on between anything with the word Jeffrey Epstein associated with it is out there. The latest is Prince Andrew's reaction to how he's been roped into all of this.
Oh, I know. And, well, you've got to go out there and try and watch the video, the BBC interview. This was not a wise thing for Prince Andrew to have done, apparently. And even his media relations people, I know one of them resigned right before he decided to do this. He felt it was necessary. Now, typically the royals have the ability to get the news organizations not only to give them fairly softball interviews, which they did, but also to give them the questions in advance so that they can prepare. Now, that didn't occur, is what I've heard. But, he had a very interesting defense of his position, which is, a number of things. Because, we all know he's out there and he's got that photograph with him and Virginia Roberts Giuffre where he's got his arm around her waist and she has her arm around his waist. And, of course, Ghislaine Maxwell is in the background. There are a number of other photographs involving him and young women as well in various states of embrace. But he goes on television and says that he believes that photograph of him must have been faked because he doesn't hug in public. Well, then several UK publishers came out with, just a series of the photographs where he was hugging in public and, kind of blowing up his story. Another thing that he says, well, clearly this proves him to be innocent, is that he does not sweat. And apparently Virginia, who was then Virginia Roberts, who's now gotten married, but at the time, Virginia Roberts, she said that essentially he had been sweating all over her on a dance floor. I think it was in Saint-Tropez. But in any event, he said, well, clearly that could not have been me because I don't sweat, because during the Falklands, that was his explanation.
This is the funniest part of it, why he doesn't sweat.
Well, during the Falklands War, he was shot at, right? Like nobody's ever been shot at before. And it created such an overdose of adrenaline in his body that his body stopped sweating. Now, he did mention that he's recently, were any cameras to catch him lightly perspiring, he did mention that he's recently begun to regain the ability to sweat.
That'd be a good treatment for people who have sweaty palms. Give him a big dose of adrenaline.
He was sweating when he was talking about this.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, what an explanation. You just have to wonder. And, some more news. I mean, you got to watch the videos and go out there and see some of the quotes from him because it just doesn't ring true, at least not to me. And it sounds like it was a pretty stupid thing for him to have gone on TV to defend himself if that was the defense that he was planning on mounting. But you also want to go out there because, lest you think that this is something only for British tabloids and for out there type segments. Actually, Kevin McCarthy sent a letter to the president of ABC News yesterday, and in that letter was questioning the president of ABC News about the Amy Robach story that we've all probably seen by now, where she came out and said that ABC News killed the story on Jeffrey Epstein, that they had him, in so many words, dead to rights. They had the evidence, they had the pictures, they had multiple witnesses, a lot of backup evidence, and ABC News would not let her run with that. Now, since that's occurred, she's backed down from that, of course, I'm sure under intense management pressure. We've seen one person be fired who was a staffer for ABC News, who apparently was not even the person who released this secret recording. But anyway, Kevin McCarthy, who's the leader of the House Republicans, actually wrote to the president of ABC, and you should go see this letter. But he asked him a number of questions, including, will ABC News provide Congress the interview Ms. Robach conducted with the victim, Virginia Roberts Giuffre? What did ABC News learn about Jeffrey Epstein after Ms. Robach first presented her story to executives? Who was involved in deciding this story was not of public interest, and what were their reasons for so deciding? Can Ms. Robach explain the outside forces she mentioned as potentially responsible for the story not running, and so on and so forth? And essentially the questions are, what did they know and when did they know it? And folks, they must have had a mountain of evidence because A lot of that's come out. A lot of it hasn't come out, but it's not like the Jeffrey Epstein pedophile ring was a secret. That's been known about and talked about for decades. In fact, he was convicted in a sweetheart deal where he pled to one charge of prostitution with a minor back in 2008, but it was well known about even at that time. And, of course, you still have people like Prince Andrew, who subsequent to that in 2010 actually went and stayed with Jeffrey Epstein at his house, which, of course, Prince Andrew attributes to his being too honorable. He was too honorable of a man to have not stayed with his friend and to given him the insult somehow of not staying with him or something like that. And meanwhile, you're thinking, I think this guy, the Duke of York, could probably afford to stay maybe in the Waldorf Astoria or something, keep a little bit of distance if, as he claims, he was there to end the friendship. And this really wasn't the out there segment that we had planned for today, and we're not going to really have time to get back to it, but we wanted to circle back into our question about the media and the culture of what kind of a world do we live in, where it seems like the media is putting forward untruth, and it seems like even untruths are getting ensconced in legal judgments. We see the untruths that are being put forward in the impeachment process, but another untruth that I think is pretty powerful and really disturbing is the jury verdict against David Dilaudid in California. And he was the guy, remember, who got the hidden cameras into Planned Parenthood and exposed the fact that Planned Parenthood was engaging in widespread sale of parts of aborted babies, which is totally illegal and wrong. And you know what's since happened now? He's been convicted, not criminally, but he's been convicted civilly of defamation and fraud. Fraud in the way that he got the people in there with the cameras, and defamation for revealing this stuff about Planned Parenthood, which they, I guess, are claiming is not true, even though it's plainly true. And he was hit with a punitive damages verdict totaling, I believe, $2.2 million. So essentially, financially, his life is over with, and he'll probably never be able to own anything or hold any assets of any significance. And all this young man did was, as a citizen journalist, try to reveal to you the truth about the fact that not only does Planned Parenthood murder babies, which is exactly what they're doing, but they then take the body parts from those babies and they sell them at a profit. They traffic in human organs and human body parts of the aborted babies, which some companies are apparently willing to pay a lot of money for the idea of researching stem cells and using stem cells and other things. So what a highly disturbing story. That's the end outcome of all of this, is not that he's celebrated as a hero for revealing the truth to us, but that he's now a villain for having done exactly that. I'm Morgan Streetman, and that's the way I see it.
Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.